Ahoy! Today we're talking more about the new lizard wizard in SMITE Tiamat. And this time we're talking about builds and playstyle tips. We will not talk about her abilities and depth and her leveling order here because I've already done that, so if you want to see that, there's a video link for that right here. This assumes that you already know how her kit works and how to level her. We'll begin right away with playstyle tips and general strategies for Tiamat. Now, what you need to understand about Tiamat is that she is meant to be used with both of her stances. And this is true both when building her full damage or when building her more tanky. The mage part of her kit actually has pretty decent damage and CC, but if you really want to take down a target, you will often need to swap into the other stance as well, and that is sometimes a risky choice. That's because switching between her ranged and melee stance puts her only escape ability on cooldown, because you can't switch back immediately with the exception of building Staff of Murden. So hard engages on Tiamat with her escapes should be very calculated, and you should be aware of any surrounding enemies since they can easily be punished as well. You can obviously reduce the punishability by increasing your defenses or getting more cooldown reduction so you can swap stances quicker. In early game, her playstyle varies a little bit between different roles. In mid lane, with a more damage focused build, you actually have a decent amount of burst, which allows you to take down damage in the early game on your own, sometimes even without the use of your melee stance. In solo, that is obviously also possible, but usually requires a lot more poke since the survivability of your enemies is higher and you're typically going into less damage at the start of the game, so that your own survivability is also higher. In late game, however, the playstyle becomes a lot more similar. Even with a tanky build, you typically don't want to be the first one to hard engage. What I found most effective is starting most fights in your mage stance. This is because your mage stance offers you most for laning, for clearing, and through the summons as well, when you're not actively looking to box someone. Especially when you have enough cooldown reduction to summon serpents in between to push up lanes, then you definitely want to use that as much as possible, which requires you to be in mage stance. It also means that when you want to hard engage on enemies, you have your leap available to close the distance quickly, and it also gives you access to the bull summon, allowing you to slow down enemies when you're engaging and also consume the bull for extra mitigation. So for example, when going into a fight, you could poke an enemy with your 1 and 2, and then if they are very low and you want to stay in mage stance, you could send the tornado after them, or if you want to hard engage on them, then you send the bull after them, and then jump after them with your melee stance swap. And then you have all your melee abilities available, and you can consume the bull for extra stacks of the mitigation. So you'll have at least 3 stacks, 1 from the swap, 1 from your ultimate, and 1 from the bull, if not more. And you will deal a lot of damage to an enemy that's already CC'd very quickly. The only benefit of starting in melee stance is that you can pre-stack mitigations, but typically you can actually stack them quickly enough so that that won't be an issue. But again, keep in mind that the moment you hard engage, people might recognize that and turn on you, so it's best to do that when your tank is already engaging, when other enemies are possibly occupied with your carries or your mage, so that really you're not immediately in the focus of all their attacks. Let's briefly talk about Tiamat's playstyle in different roles here. In mid lane, again, I think you have pretty good kill potential on level 2. You can actually play relatively aggressive there if you max your 2, but then you also give up the safety of having your escape on level 2, so that's a decision you have to make. Generally speaking, her clear is relatively good, and in mid lane the enemy will typically not body block it because they would take too much damage from it, so that's not an issue. Ganks onto her lane are also pretty decent. If your jungler has a little bit of CC, even just a slow, it can be enough to set up the stun from her 2, which then sets up the 1, and that often is enough for a kill already. So that is very useful. And she also has a pretty good gank potential when she rotates into other lanes, especially with her bull as well. If you ever need to back in middle, you can just put down 1 spawner of the serpents and you will basically not miss out on any XP or gold unless the enemy mid laner clears them very quickly, and usually you won't even lose much lane pressure. Be very cautious about when you go into melee stance, because again, it sacrifices your escape, and your escape from melee into ranged stance is also a lot worse and a lot shorter in range, so that makes you very vulnerable. Even the leap as an escape feels a little bit slow. You get some mitigations right after, so that can save you, especially if you use the ultimate, but she is not the safest mage, and if she gets pressured out hard by the enemy team, then she's very much a sitting duck, and it's hard for her to come back into late game as her scalings aren't the best. Also, and this applies for solo as well, some mid laners can interrupt her 1, and that really hurts her. Tiamat solo is a bit of a different story with some advantages and some disadvantages. Her early clear is not the best here, especially since you typically have to opt into more defensive choices, which means you are kinda just sitting back for a while. You're typically not securing the first totem, but that is also not necessarily an issue for her because she isn't really an early game pressure god. While it is tempting to go into melee stance, I typically found that even in solo it's better to generally sit in the range stance and then use the melee stance when you want to hard aggress or when it has a specific purpose, since again you lose a lot of escape potential. Ganks in solo are more common now, and her clear is also much better here when you stick to the mage stance. Additionally, it's her passive in mage stance that restores health for minion death, and you don't want to miss out on that since that's her main sustain here. It's often more advisable to get the escape on level 2 here as well, because typically you won't get early pressure as well, and it lowers the risk of getting first blooded at that point. There are some unique mechanics about solo though, which are revolving around the Scorpion. These serpents that you can summon will actually not push the wave up further when there is a Scorpion. They will aggro on the Scorpion and die to the Scorpion unless the Scorpion is killed by something. So this is worth keeping in mind if you want them to push waves back and stuff. At the same time, she has a super easy way to secure the Scorpion. The consume mechanic of her 1 actually works on the Scorpion, so as long as you get close enough to the Scorpion and just go in a melee stance and use your 1 when the enemy has gotten it low, you will always secure it from them. At the same time, this puts you into your melee stance, which again puts you at risk for other things. So consider if it's worth it, but sometimes it can be and they can't really counter it. Again, a problem here is that certain solo laners can interrupt her clear, her 1 in mage stance. If that happens too often and you can't change it through your positioning, you might have to clear in melee stance, which is a bit rougher. In both lanes you can double spawn buffs through consuming them, but unless your support is in solo, typically this is only really beneficial in the middle lane, and even there it is often not utilized. Often the support doesn't even get that they're supposed to pick it up, or they're busy somewhere else. When it comes to ability usage, most things are relatively straightforward. Use the ultimate and melee stance in order to get the most mitigations possible, so use it in the middle of the enemies. Try to telegraph roughly where the enemy will go when you're using your 2 in the range stance, so you can stun them. That's all very obvious, but the things that I think are worth talking about a little bit more are the 3 summons. The Serpent specifically, I would always recommend spawning under your tower or in a spot hidden somewhere. This is because if the enemy steps on the spawner, they can remove the spawner and then no more serpents will spawn from it. If they have to go under your tower for that, that punishes them a lot more. And even if they do that, if they are that ahead, then you can go into your melee stance and consume some of your serpents and probably punish them back because you have a mass amount of mitigation then. And speaking of mitigation, let's talk about the usage of serpents in a fight, something that mostly applies for solo. If you have spawned some serpents and you have cleared the wave and the enemy is now fighting your serpents, they will deal reduced damage due to the damage reduction that these serpents apply. If you engage into your melee form and consume the serpents then with your 1 and deal damage to the enemy at the same time, you have additional mitigation while the enemy damage is temporarily reduced. So this gives you a time window which you can abuse relatively nicely to deal a lot of damage to them and take relatively little. Keep in mind that the reduction scales with the rank of the ability and isn't that high in the beginning. If you're looking to box an enemy and haven't spawned any serpents however, I would recommend using the bull over the serpents. The bull will rush to the enemy immediately, will slow them and deal further damage, typically more than the serpents, and can also be consumed for mitigation. So if it's an immediate boxing fight you're after, I would use the bull over the serpents, or even the tornado depending on how much protection you want or if you're planning to swap stances into melee stance at all. Likewise, serpents can be used to split push or even farm golden XP from other lanes. I often end up using them from base and just dropping them to see which lane I want to push up a little bit, push back a little bit, or get some farm from, and then spawn them and go wherever I need to go. Especially in late game, this can be very beneficial since the ability is on such a low cooldown that by the time you arrive to a fight, it's probably already back up again. Also, keep in mind that if your cooldowns are short and you're expecting a fight to happen soon, you can place down a bull near the area that you expect the fight to happen. So for example, if your team is clearing Fire Giant, then you can drop down a bull in the area that will charge onto the first enemy that comes too close, and shortly afterwards you'll probably have another ult for the tornado anyways if you want to use that. The bull lasts for 30 seconds and I think most people heavily underutilize it. The third ability, the Storm, is definitely her best damaging ability out of the 3, and the CC is also very nice, but it's also very delayed, so often enemies can get away from it, or you might not hit the target when you want to hit them, or it might actually knock them further away from you. So that's a bit of a risky choice, and it really depends on how much damage you have behind it, if it's worth it or not, and also how many enemies are around. In a bigger team fight, I would typically prefer this. One important note for this ability: make sure that your ultimate is activated before pressing the button. I've had it happen a few times that due to just the slightest ping, the slightest delay, I would actually end up switching into melee stance instead of firing off the ultimate, just because there was a little bit of a delay on the switch into the summon stance. This doesn't happen on 0 ping in jungle practice, but it can very easily happen on just 70 ping or something. And while I could talk about more nuances of a playstyle forever, it's time to switch over to builds. First of all, what does Tiamat want? Tiamat definitely wants to have cooldown reduction. This is especially because her ultimates are on relatively short cooldowns, and if you get some cooldown reduction, they almost feel like normal abilities in their total cooldown duration. This also gives you the potential to summon more serpents, which gives you a lot of pressure all across the map, and it allows you to swap stances more frequently, which is very important for her to fully effectively utilize her kit, in my opinion. Along with that, she benefits a lot from penetration or protection reduction or effects with damage increase, more so than going into raw power. She doesn't scale all too much with power, but her abilities have decent base damage and she has a lot of them, so overall in most cases she gets more damage out of those stats. I know that technically her Mage Stance 1 and the Tornado have high scaling, but in most situations you will not be able to easily confirm all ticks of those, and then the benefit is significantly lower. Outside of that, she benefits from protections and health, since this increases survivability along with her mitigation and melee stats. It's important to note that Flairboot has already found out that her mitigation is actually different from item mitigation, and they're not additive, so she can't effectively reach 100% damage mitigation. As such, building mitigation to reach this isn't really beneficial. It is rather an interaction like Executioner and Titan's Bane. But at the same time, it's also not bad to build some more mitigation on her, because her survivability in general just goes up so much. So I think it's worth keeping in mind that this isn't necessarily an insane combo or a stat that you have to fully focus on, but it's also far from bad. So based on those stats, which items are interesting for her? Gem of Focus stands out as probably the best item for her. I ran some tests, and even if you have to stack it mid-fight and don't stack it at all before the fight, it still has such high damage output for her compared to other things. And it comes with increased mobility, which she really enjoys on a melee stance, and it comes with extra mitigation, which she generally enjoys as well. This is the perfect item for her in terms of increased damage and survivability across all the stats, even including the health and stuff like that. The only downside being that you get it relatively late. Another item that is extremely beneficial for her is Spear of the Magus. I ran damage tests with this, and this comes out on top of basically everything because of how this damage increase works with her base damage on the abilities, and the fact that she applies it with her first ability and has it for all abilities afterwards. It even beats out things that you would expect to work very well, like Soul Reaver, by a mile. On the topic of Soul Reaver, I thought it would be completely ridiculous on her because she has so many abilities, but against a squishy, this doesn't really offer more damage than something like Rod of Tahuti, for example. The base damaging values on the item are simply a little bit too low to make it work effectively against squishier targets. So I think this is only really worth building if the enemy team comp is very, very tanky, and then only if you've already built Spear of the Magus. Soul Gem is an item that I think is incredibly strong on her. It increases her survivability a fair bit, she can proc it very consistently, it gives her that little bit of extra damage, which she typically doesn't get that much of through the proc of it. So really no reason not to build this, and I think any Mage Tiamat build should include Soul Gem at some point. Pridwin is an item that I think is worth mentioning when talking about tankier builds for her, since it comes with a lot of cooldown reduction, makes it very easy to max that out, and the passive effect can be procced super easily, which drastically increases her protection basically, especially going into melee stance if you have the shield and the mitigations. The downside, especially in Conquest here, is that if you send out serpents from base, that might proc it, which makes it a little bit frustrating. Regardless of that, I would say it's an effective item on her that's worth considering, whereas Staff of Myrddin is a bit more complicated in that regard. Staff of Myrddin actually allows you to double swap stances by using the stance swap after you used an ultimate in one of the stances, and therefore get access to both of your kit. The problem is, again, it can proc at the wrong time because you might summon some serpents, and also it forces you to use your stance swap as the next ability afterwards in order to get the effectiveness, which if your other abilities aren't on cooldown is actually not effective at all. This means you have to arrange your entire ability usage around this item and be confident that that is the right timing to stand swap and that you will want to swap back right after. I think situations where this is consistently effective are extremely hypothetical. It's not a bad item on her and the stats are still decent, so if you want to build it, go ahead, but I think if we're looking at it in comparison to Pridwin, Pridwin generally offers her a fair bit more. When it comes to boots choices, Tiamat is relatively flexible. I almost exclusively build cooldown reduction boots because I really value having a little bit more of that early reduction, but technically you could also get away with Truth or the Magi if you want some early sustain and some quicker clear at that point, or with Reinforced Shoes if you're looking to get the cooldown reduction from other items later and you want more survivability in early game, which especially in solo is completely fine and possible. The last item that I want to point out here is Spear of Desolation, which if you're using the mage stance in a fight might allow you to cycle through your abilities in mage stance again, which can often be useful if you can't really find a spot to engage and keeps you more useful as long as somebody dies somewhere. Now let's talk about builds for mid and solo, beginning with mid. The starter I would recommend is Conduit Gem. I know Vampiric Shroud is being built as well, and I can see why you would want to use that with the upgrade being relatively easy to proc on her, but I don't think she is as much of a lifesteal god as she is someone who just wants to be tanky in late game, and I think Gem of Focus is just the best upgrade available for her in most situations. Even if you end up wanting to play her super mage focused, then you probably want to have Archmage's Gem at that point anyways. So Conduit Gem just provides you with what you need, especially because it comes with MP5 as well, and this is very, very important for her. A big problem for her in middle lane is that she burns through mana in the early game, especially if you stand swap just once. I've tried other starts, I've tried rushing Soul Gem, but it always meant that I had to buy a lot more pots, and even then I still struggled more with mana. I think the best start along with Conduit Gem is Lost Artifact for her. That comes with a bit of a downside though, because what you really want at this point is maybe some flat pen, something like Spear of Desolation, and it just doesn't feel as good to start out that way. I typically end up going Rod of Tahuti just to have that out of the way essentially. It gets you a lot more clear in early game and the passive is nice, but the downside is that it is very expensive. You can also go Doom Up if you want that in your build. Typically I don't find myself using it as much since she already gets her movement speed from Gem of Focus. What I see built a lot is Chronos Pendant, and I would specifically advise against that. There is a reason why the win rates with Chronos Pendant are significantly lower than everything else. Chronos Pendant as an early game item is typically not that effective. The power is not the highest, the price is relatively high, and the passive is more effective once you have 40% cooldown reduction in general. So I think Chronos Pendant is something you can build late game on her if you don't have enough cooldown reduction, but in early game I would advise against it. And resulting from that, the first item that I finished before Rod of Tahuti are cooldown boots. In early I have decent clear and poke with the one anyways, so I don't rely as much on getting the highest power possible, but then by the time that you can build Rod of Tahuti, it is beneficial to get a bit of a power spike through it, so it works out okay. I would prefer another item, I would prefer Spear of Desolation here, but you can't have it all. After that I go into Spear of Desolation whenever possible, so that you can get the flat pen and some more cooldown reduction, though sometimes you will have to build Divine Ruin here, which isn't exactly that effective on her. Then I go into Soul Gem if I didn't need the sustain earlier, since now we can cycle our abilities very, very quickly and get a lot of procs from it. And if I didn't end up needing any defense at this point, then I go into Spear of the Magus for a last massive power spike. At this point you should already have upgraded your Gem of Focus, and now when trading at boots I go for some option that provides cooldown reduction, ideally 20%. If you're facing a very tanky comp, you can also sacrifice some cooldown reduction and go for Soul Reaver instead. In solo, you don't have the issue of mana because you can get blue buff. Instead, you have another problem. Conduit Gem is an extremely risky item choice to start with in solo and could easily lead to you being first blooded. It can technically be built if you can play very, very careful in the beginning of the game and you think you can get through it, but it comes with a lot of struggles. I think Warrior's X is a reasonable choice since the upgrade can be very nice in late game as well if you're looking to stay in a fight for a longer period of time. You can also consider Warding Sigil, which also comes with a very nice upgrade, though not as nice as Gem of Focus in my opinion. Or last but not least, you can also consider Vampiric Shroud. Depends on the matchup as well, what kind of damage you're expecting to come out of the enemy. But generally speaking, with these items, she typically survives the early game even against high pressure solo laners. She's not gonna win it most of the time because she doesn't put out that much damage to them as well, but she will be okay, and you're not looking to win early game. After that, if you somehow manage to get through the early with Conduit Gem, you most certainly want to build reinforced shoes here. This probably applies for Vampiric Shroud as well, but if you build one of the tankier status, I would lean towards cooldown reduction boots unless you're looking to build other items to get to 40%. After that, against a physical opponent, I would go Breastplate of Valor. If you're going against a magical opponent, you can consider Genji's Guard, or if you don't need the CDR and lane pressure at that point that much, you can also go into Oni Hunter's Garb. Technically, Void Stone is also an option here, though a little bit riskier. As the next item, I like building Soul Gem since it increases your lane sustain so much. Another option at this point is Pridwin if you're not overcapping with that, since it'll give you survivability in lane in another way. It depends a little bit on how tanky you're aiming to be in late game. The next slot should be reserved for whichever defense you haven't built into yet, so typically this will be your magical defense item. Again, here you have the choice between Genji's Guard if you still need cooldown reduction, Oni Hunter's Garb if you just want to go as tanky as possible, or Void Stone if you want to put out a little bit more damage, though I would say it's not the most effective item anyways. If you don't need too much of one specific type of protection, you can also look towards options like Spirit Rope here. Around this point, you're probably looking to upgrade your starter first, and then, if the game goes on long enough, I would typically go into Spear of the Magus. The damage increase that you get out of Spear of the Magus is especially drastic in a more tanky build, and will really show her late game potential, as well as helping your team by giving them amplified damage against the target as well, which is massive. When it comes to relics, in middle lane I would typically opt into Purification Beads and Aegis Amulet, since you will need that survivability. You're basically a squishy mage in most situations. In solo lane, I like starting with Shell. This gives you some extra early survivability, and it'll also help your team in late game. It's just a very strong relic in general, and kind of replaces Aegis Amulet with a more tanky build anyways. As a secondary relic, you're obviously flexible to build relics that counter the comp that you're facing. If I don't need anything specific, then I really like going into Thorns. That's because people try to punish you when you hard engage in melee stance, and if you pop Thorns in that very moment, then they get punished for trying to punish. And otherwise, if you have room to use it, you can also get Blink, since her engage potential, especially if you're ever starting from melee stance, isn't necessarily the best, and Blink kind of offsets this a little bit. To briefly mention this interaction as well, yes, she gets very quick resets out of Bumba's hammer, and it does reset in both stances. I just generally find it to be very awkward to use on her, and going into jungle just to utilize that didn't feel good to me so far, especially since she gets so much out of Demo Focus as well, which I would generally prefer using when I can. If you enjoyed this in-depth guide, feel free to click the sub button and the bell if you haven't yet, so you get notified of other future in-depth guides and other SMITE info. Other than that, thank you guys very much for watching. This was a fair bit of work, especially heavily grinding Tiamat for this as well. I hope it was interesting and insightful, and I hope to see you for the next one soon. ZiSotto, out.